of democratic South Africa is that we have not been able to live up to the reaffirmation of faith in fundamental human rights, a clear disjuncture and work between assured rights and in the equal rights of men. And the COVID-19 pandemic requires the promotion of social progress and better standards of life, and with it taken us more deeper in the economic and social impacting more those already when we consider social justice within the South African context. For example, our immediate the inequalities in accessing healthcare services is the political whilst the public healthcare sector caters to 80% of the population. This moment for South Africa marks something more than just a shift in infrastructure and therefore delivering signal quality services, displayed the resilience of the human spirit, delivers world-class high-tech medical services and to a small percentage of the population. South Africa was evident that public health facilities transition from by just witnessing to a large number of sick patients lining up for hours to access healthcare services in district. The attainment of democracy, had we given attention to, as you know, was hoped to be good health and well-being to economic justice and most important for implemented the national health insurance scheme previously disadvantaged communities. It could have been an effective on race, ethnicity, class, and gender. Would have access to all services, regardless of their socioeconomic status, to be able to own the. We also witnessed how millions of people in informal settlements and some transformations were vulnerable, including to the COVID-19 pandemic and benefiting from the expanding economy. Unfortunately, the triple challenges of inequality, unemployment, and poverty that faced South Africa then remains with us now. The hopefulness of the mid-90s has slowly been sliding into hopelessness. The South African Constitution, in particular the Bill of Rights, guarantees the rights of all people in the country and affirms the democratic values of human dignity, equality, and freedom. So when we talk about social justice, it's inextricably linked to the rights guaranteed in the Constitution. However, the reality of democratic South Africa is that we have not been able to live up to the promises of the Constitution. There is a clear disjuncture between assured rights and the lived experiences. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the stark realities and with it taken us more deeper into inequalities, impacting more those already marginalized and vulnerable groups. For example, we know the inequalities in accessing healthcare services. Whilst the public healthcare sector caters to 80% of the population, is severely overstretched, under-resourced, lacking in infrastructure, and therefore delivering poor quality services. The private sector, on the other hand, delivers world-class high-tech medical services to a small percentage of the population. It's evident that public health facilities have collapsed by just witnessing large number of sick patients lining up for hours to access healthcare services in district hospitals. Had we given attention to SDG 3, good health and well-being to all, and most importantly, implemented the National Health Insurance Scheme as planned, it could have been an effective tool to bridge the gaps in health for the rich and the poor, regardless of their socioeconomic status. We also witnessed how millions of people in informal settlements and some townships were vulnerable to the COVID-19 pandemic as they did not have access to basic water. For the same people, isolation or social distancing was nearly impossible. Had we realized SDG 6, clean water and sanitation to all, and SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities, we could have saved lives. We have also seen many South African households without enough money for basic nutritious food items. I will never forget the aerial photograph I saw at the beginning of the lockdown of thousands of people queuing for food parcels. Children who relied on school feeding schemes were left hungry. Had we paid more attention to SDG 1 and SDG 2, no poverty and zero hunger, we could have kept our people in dignity. The population, as you know, also had many pre-existing health conditions like HIV, TB, and diabetes. All these deficiencies are mainly among the Black population and among women and girls. further highlighting the intersectional inequalities. Had we implemented the MDGs in the past, which is the Millennium Development Goals in the past, and subsequently addressed the SDGs, some of the deficiencies may have been minimized. Attaining social justice, ladies and gentlemen, is addressing the intersectionality of inequalities, removing the barriers of human development and dignity that people face because of gender, age, race, ethnicity, religion, culture, and disability. And to do this, we need critical and immediate investments in integrated and interrelated SDGs. At the heart of the SDGs is the notion of creating a fair and just world, a universal call to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that all people, without any exception, enjoy peace and prosperity by 2030. Therefore, as we work to attain the SDGs, we are ultimately working to achieve social justice. Through the pledge to leave no one behind, we must fast-track progress for those furthest behind first. Social justice and the SDGs, ladies and gentlemen, are further connected to the concept of human development. When I think of human development, I am drawn to the work of my friend Amartya Sen, the Nobel laureate in economics and key contributor to the UNDP Human Development. Human development is about expanding the richness of human life rather than simply the richness of the economy of the country in which human beings live. It is an approach that is focused on people, their opportunities and choices. As we think about actions we have to take in the pursuit of social justice, I would like to identify at least three critical areas of intervention, namely addressing the intersectional inequalities that exist in the distribution of income and assets, access to knowledge and health services, social security, and the provision of a safe environment. First, inequalities in the distribution of income and assets. To address this issue, in a country marked by extreme levels of income and assets inequality, it would be vital to adopt a multi-pronged approach that includes a move towards a more progressive taxation system, both on income and wealth, physical, including land, as well as financial wealth, targeting in particular the extreme rich. According to the World Bank report here, the top percentile of households hold 71% of the wealth, while the bottom 60% hold just 7%, with financial wealth being a major factor behind this large disparity. As a response, we must design programs of quality job creations so that more South Africans can earn work-based income that covers all their needs. And we must work to strengthen the social security system that can expand coverage and thereby support the poorest and the most vulnerable. Second, inequalities in the distribution of access to knowledge. We must ensure that children from the poorest socioeconomic backgrounds access schools and universities and have access to new technologies, including access to the internet, to be connected to the world. A shock like the COVID-19 crisis, which also exposes the inequality within the education sector, will not be the last test to our society. This implies that we need to build a country that is resilient enough to respond to these and other shocks. We must support and look for ways to bridge the digital divide, which has become a key enabler in the access to knowledge. The digital divide, ladies and gentlemen, has divided our children. The lack of access to technology has once again separated our children along race, ethnicity, class, and even gender. The third one is inequalities in the distribution of health services, social protection, and the provision of a safe environment. On this issue, there is a great value in the adoption of the Universal Basic Income Grant. Such a grant allows individuals to improve their lives and increase decisions and choices when it comes to housing, education, and health, etc. It's a grant that extends the freedom of choice. Our own observations show that if the basic income grant were to be extended to those individuals already benefiting from the COVID-19 related social relief of distress grant, and with the grant value increasing from 350 rands to 500 rands a month, that would mean an annual cost to the South African National Treasury of 0.4% of South Africa's GDP, a figure that is manageable from a fiscal perspective at this time of crisis. This would not only protect the poor, but would also sustain aggregate demand and in this way support economic recovery. Ladies and gentlemen, the democratic culture and value system must be strengthened. Our systems and institutions, like the Chapter 9 institutions, should be reformed to deliver on the Bill of Rights and constitutional freedoms. We should subscribe to a different mode of leadership, a type of leadership I refer to as servant leadership, leadership that is citizen-centered and accountable to the people. On this score, I want to applaud President Ramaphosa for the swift manner in which he has dealt with the corruption associated with PPE tenders. But I must stress that the same vigor is required and must be applied to all levels of corruption, in all aspects of government and governance. Let's remember that public service is not a right. It is an honor and a privilege. And all public servants must be held to a higher standard. We must all empower our citizenry. This allows citizens to hold their leaders at all levels accountable. An informed and an engaged citizen is a powerful means towards ensuring democratic goals and social justice. There is no doubt that South Africa is at crossroads, ladies and gentlemen. We must work towards a post-COVID-19 reconstruction that focuses on people-centered development, what we call building back better in the UN and in South Africa. This means strengthening systems that can address with a high level of commitment, determination, and action to deal with the triple challenges facing South African society. We must work on delivering a country where opportunities in terms of good quality jobs are created, access to land for those who work on it is democratized, the poor and marginalized are fully protected, the basic rights to food, education, health, security are all fully met, and gender-based violence is fully addressed. We need to define a new economic and social order. By all means, ladies and gentlemen, we must attain social justice. Let us leave no one behind by realizing the Sustainable Development Goals. Let the goals be part of our DNA and our brand. I thank you very much.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The only reason why you are being shown this presentation is because in typical COVID-19 tradition, we have connectivity issues and I can't join the session live. However, it's a massive privilege at a personal level and for Growbank to associate ourselves with the Brand Africa Summit. My friend Solly Mweng and I, this has been a 2-year journey to ensure that we can participate and support the Brand Africa Summit. And for Growbank, we are a proud host and participant to the Brand Africa Summit, and I'll also explain a little bit later on an exciting recent development where Growbank is entering into a proposed transaction with Access Bank of Nigeria to acquire eventually a majority stake in Growbank and for the bank to be rebranded Access Bank South Africa. But more of that a little bit later on. I've been requested to share a few thoughts about the food value chain in Africa, to provide some reasons why Africa is a net importer of food, with clearly the potential to be a net exporter of food. What are some of the challenges and opportunities that present themselves to the agricultural space specifically in Africa, What can be done to ensure that we can become more self-sufficient as a continent? So I'm going to effectively divide my presentation in 3 parts. The first part is to focus solely on the food value chain. What is the food value chain? What components are important in the food value chain, and why it's important for the entire value chain to be in place to ensure successful agricultural development. The second part of my presentation will deal predominantly with some information, statistics on Africa and provision of food and food security in Africa. And the last component will focus on certain opportunities and threats to the agricultural space in Africa. And I'll close off my presentation with a little bit more information on the Access Bank announcement. So if we look at the food value chain, it's important to understand that there are so many components and role players in this value chain. And if we want successful agricultural development, every single part of this value chain has to be in place. The value chain starts with inputs. Inputs is what's needed, obviously, to start agricultural production in the form of seed, or irrigation, livestock feed, fertilizer. It all comes at a cost. And if this can't be funded, there is a risk to a successful value chain. We then move from inputs to production. Production is the first area where there are material risks associated with the agricultural space. Production includes aspects like access to water, access to technical skills, mentoring and coaching, access to appropriate funding, to mechanization. And all these aspects are necessary to ensure that sustainable production can take place. If any one of these subcomponents in the production space is not available or is not well looked after, it's so difficult to ensure that there's a successful agricultural development taking place. Just to reiterate what is important in the production space, farmers need land to be successful. Farmers need infrastructure and access to water. Farmers need appropriate funding structures, affordable funding structures. Farmers need access to technology and support, and access to mentoring and skills programs, extension services. Finally, farmers need access to market. Now, production risk is one of the key risks that the agricultural space is exposed to. Also a key risk for funders. If we can't find ways to mitigate the production cycle, production risk, difficult to on a sustainable basis, fund agricultural production. It also poses a risk in the production cycle is the number of biological and environmental risks that we have. Pests, diseases, which are quite common across the African continent. If that's not supported by extension services, by skills and mentoring programs, difficult to see agriculture being successful. We have, in Africa, we have scarce natural resources. Those natural resources have to be protected. Efficient use of water, efficient use of electricity. Especially in our continent, those are key aspects that we have to look after. Climate and weather-related risks. We have so many vast climate conditions across the continent. Droughts, flooding, high temperatures, hails, natural disasters, all issues that we need to take into account. If I then take the agricultural value chain further from production to transport, logistics and infrastructure tend to be quite a challenge on the African continent, or ineffective or underdeveloped logistics and infrastructure. A big barrier to entry to produce significant food commodities at world-class standards. From transport, from farm, transport takes commodities to storage and handling. From storage and handling, we get value-added processing, drying, milling, grinding. Transport logistics then again plays a part to move the commodities or the end product to markets or wholesale and retailers. And then marketing and distribution plays a massive part in the agricultural space. Marketing risk is also a key risk in the value chain. Access to markets, negotiating with retailers, with global retailers when we export, ensuring there's sufficient access to local distributors of food commodities as well. Key risk in the agricultural space we need to take into account. And then operational risk management is also a key part of the agricultural space, and that's where access to skills is very much important. So the point of this slide, ladies and gentlemen, is to emphasize the integrated nature of the agricultural value chain, the various components that we have in the value chain, so many risks that we exposed, and if we can't cater for each and every part of this value chain, it's difficult to see meaningful agricultural production taking place. If I then move on to some of the informative statistics that paints a picture on food production in Africa, this slide focuses on the increasing and rapidly developing urbanization across the continent. Currently, more than 50% of the population in Africa is urbanized. If we glance into the crystal ball, this is expected to increase to about 2/3 by 2050. Urban consumers and rural consumers have different demands and different needs. It is both a threat and an opportunity to agriculture across the African continent, because providing food to urban areas create a big opportunity for African farmers if we can do that on a sustainable basis. It's interesting how these trends have developed over time. If we look at 1990, where about 1/3 of the African population was urbanized, to 50 years later into the future, we expect roughly 2/3 of the African population to be urbanized. As urbanization and income increase, there's also much bigger demand for processed foods. If we look at the graph on the left-hand side, between rural and urban, we can see the demand for highly processed food by urban consumers compared to the demand for predominantly unprocessed food by rural consumers. The graph on the right-hand side points to the upper income level or distribution of the demand for highly processed food versus unprocessed foods between the various socioeconomic groupings across the continent. The poor has a high demand for unprocessed food, and that's where subsistence and smallholder farmers play a big part, whereas the upper or more affluent consumers prefer highly processed foods. And this is a trend that we'll see developing across the continent over the next few years, this big demand for highly processed food in urban areas. This slide shows the gap between imports and exports in Africa over the last 20-odd years. It's still surprising that the continent has not yet been able to become a net exporter of food commodities. Even though production has increased, productivity levels remain low, and we still require as a continent to import a significant amount of food substances from other areas. Demand for food in Africa, or food imports as a percentage of global food imports, have stayed stable over the last 20-odd years in and around the 15% level. And it's important that over the next few decades, we can move this line to a negative line, or where imports of food into Africa is reduced substantially. If we look at where imports are taking place by region, roughly 1/3 of imports into Northern Africa, 25% into Southern Africa, 24% West Africa, and you can see the contribution of imports by Central Africa and East Africa. If we move to the right-hand caption, you'll see the significant exports taking place predominantly by Southern Africa and West Africa. Roughly 2/3 of exports. You can see disproportionately that West and Southern Africa exports roughly 2/3 of food commodities, or their proportion of exports of all African food commodities, whereas West and Southern Africa imports approximately half of food commodities. So there's still a lot of work that can be done in Northern Africa, Eastern Africa, and Central Africa to increase exports of food and food commodities, specifically in Northern Africa. We look at the major commodities being imported into Africa. Cereals, roughly 1/3 of imports, and surely there's an opportunity for Africa to increase the production of cereals and cereal-related maize meal, wheat production. Vegetable oils, sugars, dairy products, meat. It's just incredible that in Africa we still have to import meat products into the continent, fish, and then other imports, which would be a whole host of issues. Fruit, vegetables, and so forth would be part of that specific category. But of 74 billion rand of imports into the continent, it's astonishing that we have to import, and that was the average over a 10-year period, roughly $23 billion in cereals into the continent. Next slide looks at food exports and what is being exported. And interesting in this slide is that it's mainly a number of high value commodities, specialized commodities. Look on the right-hand side: cocoa, edible fruits and nuts, coffee and tea, edible vegetables. Look on the left-hand side, how small the composition of oilseeds, sugars, animal and vegetable fats, preparation of vegetables and fruit. It's actually incredible that we can't find a way to export, and it's clearly we have to import so much grain and wheat-related products, but that we can't find a way to produce more of this in the continent. So if we look at the value chain that I presented initially, and also focus on the statistics that I've just shared with you, why can't we find a way as a continent to produce more agricultural commodities? And here are some of the reasons, the challenges that we're exposed to. We have to be able to produce food commodities on par with global standards. Quality is essential. If we want to export to China, Middle East, European markets, US markets, if we can't produce food at the same quality as those markets, we are not going to be competitive. Competitive both from a quality of product perspective and from an affordability perspective. There's a high demand for funding. And funding is a big barrier to entry. If you cast your mind back to the agricultural value chain that I presented at the start, farmers have to incur costs before they can start producing food commodities through the production cycle. And therefore, affordable funding is necessary. All sorts of barriers that we have, barriers to entry that we have. It's expensive. Inability to provide security. All aspects that plays a part in not providing funding, not being accessible to consumers. Wage competition. Urbanization reduces the available rural labor pools. There's always a flight away from the urban areas, and therefore requirement to get more rural, bigger rural labor force. High transportation costs and weak integration into global supply chains. Weak logistics and infrastructure is a big barrier to entry for agriculture across the continent. Inter-Africa exports. There are all sorts of high taxes that are being charged by geographies of various countries when commodities are moved from one country to another country. That really has a negative impact in the ability to export across the continent. Lack of branding. There is not so much visibility of African products in global markets. And then climate change plays a big part, and having to adapt to climate change on a continuous basis. So these are all the challenges that we're exposed to ensure that there can be significantly more agricultural production in Africa. And these are some of the barriers to entry to ensure finance. Security. In South Africa, we have land tenure. So land can be pledged as collateral by a farmer if a farmer raises the land. That's something that we don't find in other parts of the continent. So there's not really an opportunity to encumber assets to raise funding. So other ways have to be found to reduce production risk. Own contribution, because of the cyclical nature and high-risk nature of agricultural production, impacted weather plays and volatility in commodity prices, there is a requirement for an own contribution to be made by a farmer. Because that's rarely available, the result is that agricultural products are over-leveraged, implying that there are too much debt and too little equity in the balance sheet structure of the projects. And that implies that the farmer has to pay expensive funding costs on an over-leveraged balance sheet, which is a clear barrier to entry. Repayment ability, and that moves to the and that also is in addition to the previous point on own contribution. The more interest costs the farmer has to pay, the lesser the chance the farmer has to repay its existing loan facilities. And then weak or no balance sheet, we know that small-scale farmer has no financial history, they don't keep financial history, so it's important that we find ways to resolve all these barriers of entry that we have in the agricultural space. Opportunities, well, focus on urban markets. Clearly, with the increase in urbanization across the continent, the expected increase, and the high demand for processed food, technology will play a key part in enabling farmers across the continent and participants in the value chain to increase the production of highly processed food. We need to find ways to reduce the cost of cross-border trade in South Africa, and there the governments and the tax authorities will have to play a leading role in reducing the agro-processing capacity. This is something that needs to develop across the continent, especially with the focus on highly processed food that we'll see developing over the next few years and decades. Value chain approach is absolutely critical. In my last slide in this section, I'll provide a little of input on what an integrated value chain model would look like. Food safety, traceability, and increased access to markets. How can we make African food commodities more attractive to international markets, marketing channels? Those are opportunities that we can develop. Technology will become cheaper and will be more widely available to improve agricultural productivity. So a combination of predicting what market trends will develop into, increasing use of technology, making cross-border trade more accessible, and then the role of technology will ensure that we can become more self-sufficient and hopefully one day a net exporter of food as a continent. As a value chain solution, in the absence of, and if you cast your mind back to those barriers of entry that I've mentioned from a agricultural funding perspective, it's important that we find this value chain where we find a way to link smallholder farmers and development farmers to commercial farmers. So what we need is we need government and DFIs to play a leading role in providing cheap funding to fund managers that can be supplemented by technical partners and accountability partners to provide technical support, technical innovation monitoring to producers of food commodities, acquired farms, existing farmers from the project or scheme, and importantly that they are supported by commercial farmers that can be a lead off-taker partner and ensuring that there's access to market for the various small-scale farmers across the continent. They can then provide access to exporters, processors, retailers. This is very much an integrated value chain where nobody operates in isolation, and for each and every part of the value chain, somebody is responsible for it, and the farmers who are responsible for the production is not left to their own devices, and they can have access to an integrated value chain and access to a supply distribution channel. Then just finally, from a Grow Bank perspective, I mentioned that we and Access Bank announced last week that Access Bank has entered into an arrangement with the existing containing shareholders of Grow Bank to acquire, to invest up to 400 million rand in equity in Grow Bank over the next few years and to acquire majority stake. So Grow Bank will become part of the Access Bank group. The bank will be rebranded to Access Bank South Africa. It opens up exciting opportunities to Grow Bank to play a much larger role in Pan-African banking, specifically in the Southern African region, where Grow Bank can play, or Access Bank South Africa can play a leading role in supporting Access Bank's endeavors, where they see themselves as the gateway to Africa. Exciting transaction, be able to integrate Access Bank South Africa into a global Pan-African banking giant and can play a leading role in expanding our banking services. So from a Brand Africa perspective, a Pan-African banking brand for South African subsidiary that can play a meaningful role in promoting cross-border transactions, making cross-border financing and cross-border banking opportunities more accessible to businesses operating across the region, and clearly lots of benefits for the agricultural space as well. Ladies and gentlemen, that's my part. I hope you enjoyed it. Looking forward to sharing the rest of the conference with you.
Thuli Madonsela, convener of the Africa Brand Summit, Your Excellencies, fellow panelists, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed an honor to share this panel discussion with the distinguished Professor Jonathan Jansen of the University of Stellenbosch. Professor Jansen, before we start, I have a little confession to make. It was indeed my life's dream to study at your university way back in 1983. But as it was way back then, I simply did not have the financial means to do so. But I continue to admire the massive achievements of your university, and I remain a huge admirer of the university's world-class student choir under the conductorship of André van der Merwe. I invite all members who are listening in to our broadcast to please listen. You can find it on YouTube. Please listen to their interpretation of Nkosi Sikelel and An African Prayer. But that's enough of promoting the University of Stellenbosch and its choir. Let's knuckle down and let's start this discussion, because Africa faces a severe learning crisis that undermines economic growth and the well-being of all its citizens. According to a World Bank study, Africa has made considerable progress in boosting primary and lower secondary school enrollment, and the figures that I use are prior to the COVID pandemic. But some 50 million children remain out of school, and most of those who attend school are simply just not acquiring the basic skills necessary for success later in life. The World Bank argues that learning levels across the region are alarmingly low. Let's look at some of the statistics. Among second grade students assessed on numeracy tests in several sub-Saharan African countries, 3/4 could not count beyond 80. And 40% could not do a one-digit addition problem. In reading, between 50 and 80% of children in the second grade could not answer a single question based on a short passage they had read, and a large proportion could not read even a single word. Progress in the region has been mixed, and some countries, including South Africa and Zimbabwe, have universalized access to basic education. So we speak about primary and lower secondary education. Other countries, including the Central African Republic, Liberia, Chad, which had been affected by conflict and political turmoil, are lagging behind even in primary school access. In most countries, however, despite rapid advances, richer children, urban children, and boys have the highest access to lower secondary education. The World Bank Senior Director for Education says, providing a high-quality basic education for children across the region is an economic necessity. The study lays out concrete steps in 4 priority areas. The first one, providing universal basic education with a focus on equitable access. The second area, quality and retention. The third, ensuring effective management and support of teachers, increasing financing for quality education. And finally, the fourth, boosting institutional capacity. The report urges countries to focus on student progression and the traffic jam in early grades, where children are stuck for many years with little learning and are often taught in a language they don't fully understand, ensuring regular student attendance, reducing repetition and class size, and implementing a language of instruction. Policies are factors critical to ensuring foundational learning. The study also calls for the elimination of the high-stakes examinations between primary and lower secondary schools to ensure student progression. There is also need for better teacher support, particularly around issues of recruitment, preparation, deployment, supervision, and support at school level. Policies need to address high rates of absenteeism and a lack of teacher knowledge and skill, with a focus on better and more effective teacher preparation programs, on-the-job support, and incentives. According to the study, African governments spent an estimated $204 per student for primary education. This is less than half of the amount spent in South Asia, the region with the next lowest level of spending. But the authors caution that more spending needs to be complemented by smarter and more strategic spending on learning materials, infrastructure, and teacher training. Countries in Africa need to design policies that fit their local context and educational needs, while building their capacity to implement dynamic programs that are open to improvement and feedback. So I would like to now address the Brand Africa Summit's network of professionals, because we can share lessons from the region, what worked and what doesn't work. And for this, to all the Brand Africa panelists, allow me to say thank you for your vision and your thought leadership. But you will agree that nice words and platitudes will just add to all the noise already out there. So what to do? Let's lock arms to start this important discussion, and let's create a solid partnership with the Africa Brand Summit to deliver smart objectives and goals focusing on education. For me, brand and education belongs to the opposite side of the same coin. It is the combination of the value of the brand and education that will provide the monetary value of that coin. Countries need to design policies and programs that fit their local context and educational needs. This includes the need to be done with coloniality of the curriculum. Let me ask you a quick question. Why then do we continue to import the predatory economic and business models? Today, more than ever, we need to stand up and show that African lives do matter. But let's be honest with each other. There is no freedom without economic independence. At the same time, let's breathe life into the range of international and regional human rights treaties guaranteeing the
was created. The Social Justice Initiative was created in 2003 so that we can make social justice the central focus of philanthropy in South Africa. Why? Because we found that philanthropy in South Africa is focusing a lot on charitable giving rather than investing money and time and knowledge and resources to advance the well-being of individuals and communities at large, at a systemic level and for the long term. Charitable giving, of course, as we know, is about addressing immediate needs. And by addressing immediate needs, that is very short term. It doesn't do much in terms of taking society forward, because what happens is that you keep giving and giving over and over again to those needs because they never go away. You can see that South Africa is, doing very well in terms of giving. You can see that in the World Index we rank very high, and even our CSI is actually doing very well in terms of contributing towards society. But again, mostly this is happening within the space of charitable giving. Next slide, please. You can see on the slide that most of CSI expenditure is actually invested mainly in education, and arguably, yes, education is about addressing issues of injustice, particularly here in South Africa, where education was denied to so many people. You can see that most of the money is going through, towards social and community development, food and agriculture. But what we have found is that most of this giving remains short-term. So if, for instance, a company is issuing bursaries to a number of, let's say, 50 students or 150 students in a system where the education, in terms of just the way it is structured, in terms of who accesses quality education, that becomes insufficient. So then how do we balance this charitable giving with social justice giving? What do we mean by social justice giving? For us, there are three things that are required for social justice giving to happen. The first one is the courage to engage power and confront structural injustices. The second is having the commitment to transform lives for the long term at a systemic level. Not individuals by individual, transforming at a systemic level. This is key. The third one, of course, is taking responsibility for the outcomes. So often we tend to look at government and point fingers at politicians about the outcomes that are there in our countries. And in terms of social justice giving, when you participate in that space, you are recognizing that you have a responsibility as a citizen in determining the outcomes of the country that you are living in. So what do we do? I mean, I love this quote before I move on about what do we do as the SGI in terms of encouraging people to give. I love this term, this quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, because he actually makes that distinction between charitable giving and changing structures so that you can have a bigger impact on society. So what do we do as the Social Justice Initiative? Let's look at the next slide. Like I said earlier, we were registered in 2013. We became operational in 2014. And what we do is that we persuade high net worth individuals in South Africa to invest in civil society. We mobilize resources from these high net worth individuals. And we are asking them to understand that civil society in South Africa is at the forefront of change. And we have seen this over and over again, where civil society is always raising the flag at the right time. It's calling on leadership, whether political or in business, both private and public spaces, to be accountable. We are asking high net worth individuals who have big, huge resources to rethink their strategies of investing in South Africa and to do so with social justice in mind. So we ask them to stand side by side with organizations that expose corruption, monitor service delivery, hold our government to account, hold them to account as well, organizations that enable access to information and ensure that people are treated fairly. And this could mean litigating at times against the state or businesses. It takes a lot of courage, of course, to do these things in a country like ours, and I think in many other countries all over the world. But this kind of accountability is what is needed to drive change. SGI has supported over 100 civil society organizations here in South Africa, And we do so because we recognize that we are nothing. We are nothing in this country without civic engagement and a strong civil society voice. Next slide, please. So when you look at what are the giving motives usually of high net worth individuals and the corporate leaders that we tend to engage with, we find that corporate leaders, corporates in general, they invest in communities as a license, as a way of attaining license to operate, as a way of complying with some of the regulations and ensuring that they can continue to make profit. We know that with new and old wealth individuals, they give because they care about the well-being of their family members, of their community members. And what we are asking for is that while these things are important, there are greater, there is a greater importance, or there is a greater significance when you look at how your giving, your philanthropy is actually enabling a change at a systemic level. Next slide, please. So, what do we need? So these are some of the organizations that we are supporting, or we've been supporting in South Africa, or we've supported in the past, in the last 6 years. And our view is that what is needed to realize social justice, I heard the previous professor, really give very good insights about some of the solutions that we can take as a society to move ourselves forward towards a more just society. For us at the SJI, what we need now is to have human beings who lead from a higher consciousness, human beings who understand that we are interconnected to everything, to nature. We need an ecosystem approach. We are connected to each other, to nature, and I think that there is nothing that has proven that to us like COVID-19. The pandemic has shown us just how vulnerable we are, that we are all vulnerable, and therefore, for us to rebuild ourselves and rebuild this country, we have to think of everything that we are connected towards. And this idea of leading with this consciousness around interconnectedness does not have to reside only with leaders. We think that it is a responsibility of all citizens to think that way. In that way, we are able to foster a type of philanthropy that has a higher impact. The second thing that we think is needed right now is that we should all take responsibility for our contribution in this country and in the continent and globally. That the time for saying it is this government, it is those philanthropists, we have to rethink that. We have to rethink what is our role, what is our participation. Are we perhaps also complicit in a system that is not serving the rest of the world? And if we are, how do we change this? So there is a lot of reflection and decisions, in our view, that need to be taken by individuals and society at large. And of course, the last one is challenging because the last point is challenging because it is about giving up of power and giving into society. We view that for equitable distribution of resources, some people have to just let go of holding on to power, to wealth in ways that are not in service of all of us. Because I think, again, the pandemic has shown us that we are all on the same boat, and if we do not move together, we will continue to be in trouble as a people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bongweni Mangshli-Geni. And once again, it was highlighted human dignity, citizenship, ethical leadership, and she's the Executive Director of the Social Justice Institute of South Africa. Thank you for bringing everything that to the fore. And a person that is
we'll
really...
just wait for session moderator.
The person I would now like to introduce that is really having this link that we have just listened to is a person that's on the ground. And you have such a immense, intense CV of working on the ground, especially with South Africa Red Cross, that I want to say, Ma Mandisa, we want to honor you here today for all the work that you have done, not just on our continent, globally as well. And everything that you have received globally, you came to give it back to South Africa. And that is why I would like the session to say, halala to Ma Mandisa, halala. I would like to give over to Ma Mandisa that will just take us a little bit through the journey of a little bit of on the ground and what you think it is civic society's input should be. You can sit.
Good afternoon. Molweni, dumelang, goeiemiddag, sanibona. The role of civil society has always, in my view, been to see themselves where they sit. I've worked for organizations where we would parachute what is called a delegate from Sweden, from Switzerland, from wherever. And the success of what we have done as organizations has been from taking the volunteers from home, from the village, from the township, because they know exactly which house has got an ailing member, which house has got food shortages, and COVID made that very clear for us that if you do not know what your neighbor is eating next door, it is pointless for you to know what is happening in America. So it has been such a good learning process to say that not just charity begins at home, but all good deeds should begin at home. So that by the time you go out to the international arena, you have your own examples. You are not having your story told by somebody else. If somebody comes with a very educated argument to you, you are able actually to say, what would my grandmother make of this? How did we begin COVID messaging in English and on television? How did we hope my grandmother was going to become part of the solution? So that's where I come from. So I don't know if you think I should continue with what I've been asked to come and do.
I think most important is in the arena of social justice. And as we've heard and as you've seen, is that social injustice is also the genocide of our new world. You've experienced it and you are working in that particular arena. If you can just give us of your wisdom, and on our African continent, you are working in an institution, South African Red Cross, but we would like to engage with you in particular on social justice.
Social justice for me is when, like this past weekend, I went to a ceremony where my cousins were receiving the family-in-law and therefore accepting the lobola. I saw social injustice in that the girl who's getting married was not part of the discussions. It was almost like you don't expect the cow to be part of the sale discussions. Now that's a little bit of gentle social injustice, but at the bigger level, when somebody wants to do good things for me but does not involve me, it becomes a problem. We decide that village A has got a shortage of water, and we go and bring in tankers with water. We do not go to the villagers, to the women who carry the water. We do not go to them and say, which is the nearest place where you have been drawing water but are frustrated because of the drought and can therefore not be able to carry the water. Remember, in any village, I have not seen a man carry water, it is women. So if we don't start with the women, then we're missing the point. Then we bring the tankers, and of course, nobody asks them about the potability of the water. Is the water salty? Does the water make your washing gray and brown? So those are the things for me that say social justice is about the equitability of what you are giving to people, the inclusion of the recipients so that their dignity may be restored. Let us not always be expected to do this. Give me, give me, give me. Let us also be asked, what can we all contribute towards making this gift more usable? So that's where, for me, social justice is about the dignity of the people, humane giving, listening to the given people as well.
Thank you. Very much wisdom. It's about equity versus equality. You can't, and I'm not going to repeat more because more has this CV, very long CV, but what is very imminent is that you're on the ground, you're there, and you say, we as civil society must make that difference. I want to continue with the dialogue. And next to me, I have Craig from Community Chest. And Craig's passion is about youth, sports, being on the ground, and is currently also part of Community Chest that looking at civil society. How do we coordinate civil society to make a difference, not just looking at government? So Craig will tell us more about the programs he is involved in, but also what his organization is currently doing in making that particular change happen.
Thank you very much. If we could bring up the presentation, I would appreciate that. It's a very short and focused one. These conferences and summits often take a lot out of us. So I'll just wait for the presentation to appear, and I'll take that as the indication that everyone that's connected is also able to see. So I'm looking at the selector. Thank you so much. So as mentioned, my name is Craig Kensley, and I'm the director of the Community Chest Coalition of the Committed. What we are really preoccupied with during this time is practical innovation as it relates to social justice, as it relates to what the response should be. And as also introduced by Marlene, it is about the civil society recovery trajectory and how we construct and play into that. And so one cannot speak about recovery without really understanding the concept of resilience. And so we look then as the coalition towards not just the concept of resilience, but really what the constructs are. And we've looked at it, broken it up, and have an understanding of the fact that it plays out across two particular dimensions. And the one dimension, if you could, sorry, let me skip to the next slide. There it is. The one dimension is the organizational dimension. And so what are the sustainability factors? How do we speak about funding parity and how that plays out for organizations? Because in civil society organizations, particularly during the pandemic, there's been an over-reliance on an under-resourced sector. And so civil society organizations are exposed to unsustainable burn rates. And so many organizations no longer exist during the course of this particular pandemic. Another facet that we look at the organizational dimension, but then also in quite a fascinating way, the territorial aspect and the territorial dimension. So how do the stakeholders in a particular space, in a particular territory, how do they act together in concert, and how do we leverage that particular influence so that we are able to make the change that we see? And we believe that social justice requires coalitions. We really mobilize, and it's fueled, that understanding is fueled by a few elements. The first of those is diversity of activities, and we'll unpack just a little bit what that means. Also the politics of influence and agency, who has influence, whose voice around the table is the loudest, and why. We also look at mutually interdependent financial actors. We need to follow the money and look at how the funding flows and what informs that. So that is very much a big part of our focus, and then also for us, hyper-local economic activity and development activity. What you'll see in the course of our work is that as we advocate for agency, we believe that that is a factor of transparency and access. And so being able to look at these systems, we put a particular strategic framework together, which we refer to as the 5 horizons. It's an open source strategic framework. It is informed by the tenets of social justice, human rights, and development intelligence. And what it allows us to do is to position ourselves and others as sense makers in the particular space. So this is not a phased approach, but certainly it breaks down the activities, as we've heard about, that are playing out and across which horizons. And there are 5 of those. I won't go into all of the detail. This will be available. But interesting for us is, as we move and have conversations with funders and actors in the space, it's about being able to locate them relative to these 5 horizons. The first horizon speaks about the immediate response and the fact that we need to resolve particular issues. The second speaks about resilience, how we map risk in the particular space, and how we then move towards this position of resilience. And I'll show some examples of that. The third speaks about how we return civil society to operating at scale. And that is critical to our survival, and that is critical as a driver of social justice. The fourth horizon is about reimagining the space through case studies, thought leadership, and policy reform. And that leads us into the fifth horizon of reform. And really, when we say reform, this really, our theory of change, what underlies the work we do, is that we want to reform, and what needs to happen is the reform of the philanthropic value chain. The way in which resources flow and are shared in this space needs to be reformed. But that can only happen from a policy position. We have, as one example, this is a piece of work that falls within our Horizon 2, and that speaks about a civil society resilience index. What that begins to do for us is, again, you can see the thematic modes of engagement, but it is very much a data-driven view, but data from the ground, where, as you've mentioned, it is about going to those that carry the water. It is about speaking to those that we view in a sanitized way as beneficiaries, and beginning to have that conversation of impact. So often, the language of impact is not accessible. And so from one funder to the next, one has to articulate and re-articulate oneself. The same program, you have to re-articulate over and over and demonstrate value. And so that lexicon and that base is not an accessible of the coalition as we put together this index, which brings in global indicators, localizes them, and says this is a shared platform of communicating impact and return on investment and impact from that perspective. And so I want to conclude with this particular statement. Civil society services a gap in service delivery by activating key support services to communities. I want to repeat that. Civil society plays into a gap in service delivery in the country. And I want to just echo something I said a bit earlier. How is that justice if there's this over-reliance on this under-resourced sector that plays into key hyper-local service delivery? And so that presents us with a particular opportunity. There's the narrative that is played out in terms of partnerships, partnership-based intervention, tracked impact, all these beautiful buzzwords. But we have a particular opportunity to look at pragmatic input from accessible, pavement-level detail, not grassroots level, pavement-level data, and indexes that track risk and opportunity within the sector. And so what we're saying is, and the message that we bring to this platform, and thank you very much for it, Solly and colleagues, is that the impact of this disconnect between social investment strategies and economic livelihoods has resulted in key players in the sector being pushed to an unsustainable resource burn rate during COVID-19. So many of our colleagues in the sector no longer exist. And this is our contribution as the Coalition of the Committed to that response. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig Kensley from Community Chest. And wow, once again, but this is such an intergenerational discussion that we are having, Mr. Solly Moheng. I want to say, as Craig was talking, Ma Mandisa was saying, yes, yes, my boy, yes. And that is why we need to have this more. When the intergenerational come to talk to each other, what do we mean with social justice? And how can we collaborate? How can we look at citizenship? And to say also, How are we going to do it for ourselves? And Mama Ndisa would like to end off this session to give more, because we wanted to listen to the young lion. He roar like a young lion. So we want to ask Ma, the lioness, who rules the world, to respond to what he has just said.
Thank you very much. I've written a lot of text because at my age we forget things easily. Yeah, let's just stay with the first one. Yeah, the one that says anything that a country does then becomes what that country is known by. This is the one. You know, you can never think of the States now without thinking I can't breathe, without thinking intolerance. At the same time, you cannot think of my hair, the little that's left, without thinking clicks. But all of that has got an impact on how people then decide, am I going to go to that country or am I going to stay at home? And a great percentage of it was covered in the morning, perceptions versus reality. You've got to go to Ethiopia to go and experience Njera. Now, who carries our brand as a country? We're all so interlinked. If there's a fever in South Africa, by tonight, Lesotho will have it, because we sneeze, they catch the cold. And anything that you see that's beautiful for the first time you go to a country stays with you. It does not go away. At the same time, any negative things you have about a country will stay with you for the longest time, and your friends as a country will go away. But most of the time we tend to put it all on the government, on the corporates. What do we say as citizens of a country? What are we proud about? What do we want to boast about when we go outside of South Africa? And do we also get that voice to talk about the brand that is South Africa, or that is Africa in general? Now, who are the people involved in all of this? There are governments, there's the corporate sector. Never allow the corporate sector to get away with return on investment, bottom line. No, we all have a role if the brand of the country is to be carried on our shoulders. Civil society and the actual communities next. I thought I would run through these slides. What is South Africa known for? Pristine, beautiful beaches. I chose the worst picture because I didn't want people to want to come here immediately. There are still, there are still restrictions in place. So let's go. The mountains, all the beautiful things about South Africa will be in the following slides. Now, it's the vast, clean coastlines, majestic mountains. I say the Drakensberg because I come from the Eastern Cape and my home village is at the foot of the Drakensberg Mountains. The fauna and flora, who doesn't know the famous Protea? Game reserves, Kruger National Park, Ado Elephant Park. You see all of those things that we are not supposed to concentrate on, the animals and the hotels. Beautiful and warm people, singing, dancing, Jerusalem, colorful outfits, world-class banking systems, scenic rural villages, pleasant weather conditions, leafy, well-serviced suburbs like the one we find ourselves in, cultural and heritage sites. We are the country that's known for winning the Rugby World Cup 2019, dancing all over with Siya Kolisi. We hosted the 2010 Soccer World Cup. We are amongst the best tourist destinations, and we are seen as the place everybody wants to be. We are obviously then an attractive investment destination, and with a promise of GDP growth and the betterment of all society. How I wish all of this was as real as I'm making it sound. Let's go to the next beautiful slide. Now, there's a village where you think, wow, rural life. Let's go to the next one. Happiness. Next one. This is probably either Umhlanga or Sentin, where people and trees compete for attention, for their beauty. Next one. Now, here are my mensen. This sun lady says, Matisa. That meaning, she's not saying Mandisa, she's saying Matisa, which means how are you? And those young men from Swaziland. Sanibona bonkosi. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Beauty. Now we are going to have to go to a site that is not so very beautiful just now. Can we return to that slide after I've shown all the pretty faces? Let's go pretty. I think it will be the next one. The next one. You're going backwards. There are other pictures of happy people. Okay, right, now let's go to the reality. Maybe we are flirting too much with the happiness. Now let's go to what I said in that other slide, that the Mandela magic moments are not the experience of every South African. There are those who live what I call the reality. The reality of life across the road. You will see when we put a slide of what I used to call a squatter camp against a leafy suburb. Sandton vis-a-vis Alex. Okay. Next one. Here is the one. Just across the road there are people who have everything that can be described as a difficulty. They have gross unemployment, they live in squalor, they have the worst kind of management of diseases. How do you think COVID would have successfully been managed there? How do you social distance in a place where there are 17 people in one little room? How do you wash your hands 5 times a day when you hardly have the water? People talk sanitizers. Isn't soap much more practical there? Because where will you put the sanitizers that are all over in this hotel? But just cross that road and see how the other side of the world lives. Those people have no access to land, to finance, to self-improvement opportunities. Violence is high, crime is high, vulnerability to disasters. Almost every 10th year, the area of Alex gets washed away by the floods. Don't ask me why the people are still allowed to build there. It's more political than disaster related. Now, what does that do to a human being? You talk social justice. The negative effect of all of that on people's sense of self-worth. Why should I care if you are safe, if I live in a place where I can take something from you in order for me to have food for my children tonight? The anger that comes from that part of the world and despair, it spills over into those that we perceive as living a better life. People describe South Africans as being xenophobic. I think the desperation of not having something makes you think the ones that have it will be the foreigners. The ones that have it will be the tourists. So I will go and rob them. I am not justifying it. I am simply saying, let us also look at the social causes of what we are faced with as a country. How can these people then care for and project the country's image and brand? They are fed up with the whole thing. So let's go. Okay, I still show you the Buremaces doing their thing there, and the ladies saying the Macheloni, good morning, and they are from Venda. Now, this is what happens when an informal settlement burns down. No fire brigade will reach that place. There are no street addresses, and therefore, you are not going to say, I'm managing it, and you want to talk social justice. All right, let's go. Now, social justice as experienced, it depends on, do you have it, do you not have it? It also depends on, was I part of the struggle and I am therefore entitled to all the goodies? Who are the players here? What should the government do? The government, it doesn't matter which country we are at. The government must act like the government, not like a party. We must not hear the ANC collective. We must hear the Mandisa Rose Madeline collective, because these are the citizens, not the subjects that we are serving. We must get into the habit of under-promising and surprise ourselves by over-delivering. We must earn, re-win, and sustain the trust of all communities, not the ones who wear the T-shirt with Zuma's face on it, no. All communities In any country, Lesotho, Eswatini, everybody must be a proud citizen and not owned by any government. And we must visibly address corruption. I hear now we're making so much noise. I want to see people in orange overalls. I want to see people paying back the money. Now, what is there for the media and PR houses? Whose story are you carrying? Every time you go to the paper to write, are you writing for me, about me, or on behalf of the person that fills the purse with the money? What voice or visibility are you giving the people of the informal and rural areas? Are they allowed to become their own voice? And we stop this voice of the voiceless, speaking for the underprivileged. Underprivileged, have you talked to me? What picture? Are you showing only the squalor, the misery, the hunger, the deprivation, and the deprivation? Or are you showing opportunity, courage, hope, success, things like rising from the ashes? Are you showing Rwanda? Rwanda, which was at some point in the ashes, but now it is one of Africa's promising areas to visit. Ethiopia, a few years ago, aeroplanes were dropping food because there was famine, but Ethiopia economically is now on the rise. Are we showing that hope? Now, somebody asked us if we should look at corporates locally or should we look at global funding. I would look at local corporates first because they draw their labor from the very villages I've just described. What are they planting back? When are they going back there to say, if this man that works for me is to be respected, he must have the facilities that are there in other areas? Global funding has one problem with me. It comes with general expectations. The UN describes a standard household as having 7 people. And I know where I come from, there are 17 people in a small shack, and they all are expected to social distance at this point. But there's also just that last line there. We must also task civil society to be credible. How many organizations have you heard of where donor money has gone down the legs of the Fed chairman's pants? The money disappears in an organization. I'm not even talking about human beings. So we must be credible. We must be accountable. And we must be trusted by both the donors and the people that we call beneficiaries. The last one. Again, we still see that beauty. I come from that last one. Botani, Molweni. And then this side is Abusheni. Good morning from Tsonga people. Last. Now, everybody will make you believe that political power rests in the indigenous people, but the reality dictates differently. It's a few misgoverning resources on behalf of the masses. But our rich and diverse cultures, our common history and current realities can really, really be the thing that says the brand is carried. Now, it is only when we have addressed all these funny things I've spoken about that we can truly say who carries, protects, and projects the brand of Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mamandisa. We have developed with all our speakers, actually, Solly, a scorecard on social justice. I think you've realized that. And this scorecard, obviously, next year, from today onwards, we need to look at that particular scorecard. We had wonderful inputs today which was recorded from our United Nations respondent in South Africa. That was Dr. Bekele-Thomas. We had also where we had Ms. Mashlenge, who is currently the Executive Director of Social Justice Institute, and her main focus was human dignity as well. And how do we look at sponsoring? How do we look and walk the talk? Then we had the young man, the young lion next to me, Craig Kensley, who specifically spoke about the pavement. I like that word, it's a new word. the pavement policies that we need to look at, and that is really looking at the impact of people on the ground. Because sometimes when we go to our communities, Mama and Disa, we think it's a whole holiday. People are sitting on the corners, and you realize this is people that's unemployed sitting. So do we engage with them? And then lastly, we had our gogo. And our gogo really gave us our scorecard in particular of who we need to address and how we need to walk the talk. And credibility is with ourselves. We can't blame anybody anymore. It is about us. We have now engagements and questions from all over that just wants to pose some questions or just wants to make a comment around a few of that they would like to highlight. And one of them is that we sometimes see the systemic level as beyond our control. How can we shift mindsets to see what is in their control to change? I don't know whether our first speaker wants to say something. Craig, you want to say something? It's about systemic change.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks for that question. I think the first thing we need to do is begin to arrange our contributions. Because so often in what I'm doing, what your contribution is, it is seen as a little bit of a competition, if we're honest. Because there's this feeling of the fact that we are competing for a limited pool of resources. And so if my voice is louder, if I'm able to articulate myself better, if I'm able to exclude you from the room, then that is to my benefit. And so in the work of the coalition, what we seek to do with our 5 Horizons framework, for example, is begin to put in its correct place that this particular initiative is Horizon 1. It is the value that it holds. This is Horizon 4, for example, etc., etc. And they don't compete. They take their proper place around the table. Communities are nuanced places. Development is, one could almost call it the alchemy of development. There's no one particular response. And so being able to come, and I come to my original statement, being able to come to a space where we are able to arrange our contributions into a bouquet, where we all can sit around the table in a meaningful way and present that to funders. I think that becomes the sense maker for us. From that position, we're able to leverage those who control resources, drive our messages there, and package the propositions.
Thank you very much, Craig. Mamandisa, I think this is such a pertinent question, which is so that we need to ask. Social justice seems to either be misunderstood or not taken seriously in Africa. How can African leaders be made to change this? Specifically posing the question to us as African leaders.
I think the best thing is to remain true to yourself. As you get those votes, if you're a leader, that make you this leader, do not lose the very basic things that your mother taught you. And I think for me, a parliament full of people that do not represent the people I've just described is really a fallacy. So we need to change the way in which we bring our leaders into their space of power. How do we vote? Is it for a party or is it for a human being whose character is such that she will not cheat us?
Thank you, Ma. I just want to check if Ms. Mhlangini is still on the line with us. Is she still on the line with us? Bongi? Because we will do our last round of just inputs. Okay, while we're waiting, just the last question I would like to pose. Most countries have social justice ministries, or must social justice be integrated into the work of all ministries? The question I will pose: how many commissions must we still have? And how many ministries must we still have? I will say that we're getting into the habit of parking things. We need to start to look at integration. We need to start that even when it comes to, we have the gender-based violence scourge. And we have every year the 16 days. And every year during 16 days, it's increasing. And we need to ask ourselves, this should be a societal mindset that needs to change. Any views on that?
I'll start with the values that make our children become bullies at schools. What do I say to my child when he leaves in the morning? Okay, grandchild in this case. By the time they become serious leaders and politicians or even religious leaders, they have gotten used to not looking out for the next person. So it starts where the value systems are nurtured at home. School complements that. And therefore, social justice should not be something that we say belongs to a ministry. It must be a way of life, just like Ubuntu.
Absolutely. And I think just feeding into that, it's about the systems change piece as well, and leveraging the scorecards. There sometimes is a notion in civil society that we lean away from and speak into, but we need to reform the scorecards and be able to say that these are the accountability standards. We do not negotiate relative to them. This is the shared language that we will use, and we drive that particular agenda. And so it is time for us to reorganize in terms of that particular pursuit as well.
Yes,
just another dramatic thing, that during the beginning of COVID-19, 90% of the money was going to food parcels. Nobody was coordinating which village or which place got the food. And not a single food parcel contained seeds or seedlings. Therefore, we are assuming that up to today, those people are still eating a food parcel. Is that true? Why do we want to make them helpless simply because they do not have the wherewithal to carry their lives on? Those people now would be eating spinach, carrots from their own gardens. Their dignity would be intact. They would have been kept active. The madness that came with COVID, the fear, the angst and everything, you manage it by working in your garden. But no, we thought, let's give them cake so that they can sit and eat and get fat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mandisa. Anybody else here before I end this session who is physically here that would like to pose or just want to make a comment? Solly?
I think it should be a key performance area for every minister. What has your ministry done to ensure that social justice is delivered? Whether you are police, or you are any other ministry. And for me, the example of a country that has really risen from the ashes, again, is Rwanda. It is a crime in Rwanda to throw a piece of paper in the street.
Yes.
It is expected of you to take such pride. And if you go to the museum in Rwanda, you stand there and think of the Tutsi and the Hutu and you want to cry. But walk out into the street and you see such positivity. So there are those recoveries. If you go to Ethiopia right now, they are busy building that dam that will make them one of the biggest. It's causing a lot of conflict, but you are no longer going to see an aeroplane that's dropping rice onto the poor people. They've moved from that poverty. And if you put that into a ministry, would you put it in agriculture? Would you put it in any? Put it all over so that each and everyone says the burden of being humanitarian as a government is on all of us.
Solly, we will just allow you because you're the organizer, yes?
Yes, I am assuming, because we all assume. We all assume that you cannot be in a certain area. You cannot be the CEO of a big transnet company if you do not know what social justice is. In the same way, Soli, as we have taken this wonderful constitution of ours, brandished it world over, it is respected world over, but were we as the citizens ever educated about the responsibility that comes with the freedoms that the constitution gives us? So it means somewhere in educating leadership, we have to start at saying, what is integrity? What is accountability? What is transparency? What is humanitarian thinking when you are a leader? Yes, we are assuming.
Wow, Mamandisa Kalaka Williams. President for you. Any last words from your side, Craig?
Maybe just to share the following reflection on whether we understand the constructs of social justice, and those in positions of executive influence understand it. The answer certainly is no. And if we look at where we could look to for funding our local corporates, let's make a very decided and marked example here, that the CSI departments that sit in our corporate head offices are the glorified stepchildren of the marketing department, because that budget is progressively and systemically laundered to marketing ends and to soft HR ends. We hide up to half of our CSI budgets in staff volunteering programs, in matching the funding of the money that the staff raise, and that's fantastic from a morale perspective, but let's be frank, that's an HR competence which you are using CSI money for. When you slap your logo on initiatives that you do, that's a marketing competence that you're slapping that you're allocating CSI money to. So how the money moves and that understanding of social justice, there's the deep value play, but there's also the scorecard piece that says we see you and we will hold you accountable.
I would like to say that this is really for us an eye-opener once again. Even us being part of this, having the dialogue, but we have the responsibility. Social justice, it's about pro-poor, it's about equity, equality, but it's also to understand the uncomfortability. Because we're not born with language, we're not born with culture, we're not born with religion. And we don't even address here the LGBTQ plus communities. We on our continent, we can be killed. So social justice, I want to leave this particular platform, that this must be always an agenda item that must go across, and not just as me as an individual who has a disability, that only look at social justice with a disability lens. It is very important, the understanding and the training, because you are born and enculturated in the community where you are born into. And as South Africans, we have the legacy of apartheid. And it is on all of us shoulders to be able and to ensure wherever we are to shed our ego, in order for us to look at how do we draw the social justice right through our organizations, our interfaith, our cultural practices, and then into our homes, because it's how we rear our children. So this is not an easy topic, and it's a topic that we're not going to find solutions now. But the question I want to pose and to leave with this forum is that we have an obligation to our young people. And it starts with the education. If this African Brand Summit can start to be that lobbyist, that in our school system must be curriculum. We can't just say that parents can parent. We can't just say that teachers can be teach. It's teachers. So what are we saying? Even on a tertiary level, teachers' education and curriculum needs to change, so that we can talk about social justice not just in a race capacity, as a humanitarian capacity. So I would like to thank everybody that's been part of this. Ma, Mandisa, we've learned a lot from you. Craig, Simba, we've learned from you that as a young person, you're giving back. You want to walk that talk and walk the talk simultaneously. To the other participants that were part of social justice, I know the Brand Summit will give us all feedback with all the recordings, especially to Bongi Mashlangeni, the Executive Director of Social Justice Institute, with Community Chest, with Red Cross. These are institutions that's changing on the ground as well. And then we had United Nations, Dr. Thomas, that was also part of this particular group. So thank you very much again for the African Brand Summit under the leadership and the visionary leadership and the humanitarian leadership of Solimoheng, that we could have this dialogue, and that this dialogue is much more broader, as we said in the beginning, not just pertaining to this group, but it's actually virtually an interaction. Thank you so much to everybody. Thank you.
So I'm being moderator for a minute here. So we have a session upstairs on counter communications, COVID. Obviously, a lot of people are already seated in that session. They think they will finish at 3, or no, just before 3. Then the last session of the day will be a media session, the role that media plays. That's going to be in plenary. And after that, we will stop for the gala awards dinner later this evening. So for now, you can join the session upstairs if you want. I think it's very interesting panel. I was torn between them and here, but social justice is something that's very close to my heart as well. And then, you must be assured, just be reassured that we have a team here that's helping prepare the report for the summit. So everything that is coming out of the summit, including the awesome presentations that came out here, are going to be captured in the summit report in the end. So nothing is being lost. But we have an option to either go and smoke, maybe I don't actually encourage you to smoke, or to go and sit out the last part of the session upstairs ahead of the last session on media discussions at 3. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay.